While Americans were busy celebrating Thanksgiving, our Brazilian friends over at QuByte Interactive quietly launched their newest classic game compilation, Street Racer Collection. This is a really cool set of racing games that spanned multiple consoles and generations. This new compilation not only features the original 16-bit Genesis and Super NES versions, but it also brings us the 8-bit Game Boy port and the more advanced 32-bit upgrade that hit MS-DOS. I spent the whole weekend playing it and I loved it, which got me wondering, what did the critics think of Street Racer back in the mid-1990s? Did they prefer the 16-bit original or the 32-bit upgrade? In order to answer those questions, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Next Generation, Sega Power, and more classic magazines that reviewed these games back when they first came out. So put down that turtle shell because you're definitely going to need a stronger weapon than that if you intend to survive this episode of Street Racer Review Crew. From the Looney Tunes to Garfield to the Cartoon Network, it can sometimes feel like we're drowning in a sea of Mario Kart clones. But that was certainly not the case in 1994. It had only been 2 years since Nintendo introduced the world to the hugely popular racing game, and only a few companies had dared to compete. This was the year when Sega got their speedy mascot to race against his friends in Sonic Drift, and Chuck Rock starred in the far less remembered BC Racers. Of all of the early karting games, it was Ubisoft's Street Racer that was the one that came the closest to actually challenging Mario's crown. Instead of being a spin-off of an existing franchise, Street Racer came with a rather tempting promise. It was going to mix the thrills of Mario Kart with a beat-em-up action of Street Fighter 2. Developer Vivid Image hoped that this, along with a likable cast of original characters, would be enough to differentiate it from Nintendo's genre-defining masterpiece. Well, let's see what the critics said. When it comes to the reviews, most magazines opted to review the Super NES version of the Genesis. This includes Electronic Gaming Monthly, who ended up giving the racing fighting mashup a so-so 7.8 out of 10. In a small capsule that was buried far away from the rest of the reviews, Iceman called Street Racer one fast-paced comical racing game. You get to race, play soccer, or be in a bumper car contest. What else can you ask for? The driving perspective runs smoothly with great sounds in the background. Tons of great tracks to race on. Cool game. When we look at the review scores, we see Game Players was also a little bit underwhelmed, giving the game a 73%. Of all the magazines, it was Nintendo Power that ended up giving Street Racer its lowest marks, going all the way down to a 3.1 out of 5. They like that the game offers a lot of great options and generally good graphics with fun characters, but was disappointed that the track perspective is a bit low and corners can be hard to see. They also complained that the 4-player split screen can be hard to follow and the backgrounds are too busy and muddle the view. While those magazines may not have been all that impressed with Street Racer, there were a lot of critics that had no problem recommending this racing game. Video Games, the Ultimate Gaming magazine, gave the game an 8 out of 10, which is more or less the same as the 4 out of 5 that we saw out of GamePro. When it comes to the highest score on the Super NES version, that belongs to Superplay, who went all the way up to a 91%. The Mortal Kombat 2 vs. Super Street Fighter 2 reference is actually more relevant than it may have first appeared. I'm sure that a situation will develop around Street Racer and Super Mario Kart in much the same way. Me? I'm pitching my tent somewhere between the two. Don't bother waiting for Super Mario Kart 2. Go out and buy this. Although there aren't very many Genesis reviews, the magazines that did cover that version gave it high marks. Mean Machine Sega went with an 88%, while Sega Power went all the way up to a 95%, the highest score of any version of the game. Imagine Road Rash 3 with more options, better graphics, add a dash of Street Fighter 2, and cars instead of bikes, and you're getting close. Another easy comparison to think of is Mario Kart suddenly appearing like a ghostly fart onto your favorite Sega Entertainment System. Oh yes, young Mega Drive owner, may your chest swell with pride. We love it! It's one of the most addictive and well-programmed games we've seen for many a moon. And us, being us, that's very high praise indeed. Now look, there were a few naysayers, but most of the critics really liked Street Racer back on the Super NES and Genesis. It earned an overall average of 81%, which is actually pretty good for this type of game. That's not that far off from the 87% average we saw from Mario Kart 64. It may not have the name recognition, but Street Racer is legitimately fun. Two years after releasing the game on the Super Nintendo and Genesis, Ubisoft brought the freshly upgraded port of Street Racer to 32-bit systems like the PlayStation and Saturn. Whereas the Super NES version used flat, Mode 7 effects, the 32-bit version featured levels with buildings and mountains and real obstacles. This is a substantially better looking game, and even allowed for up to 8 players to compete against each other all at once. That said, this was still a last-generation game that was spruced up to play on a next-generation console, forced to compete against the likes of Ridge Racer, Daytona USA, and Wipeout. Let's see what the critics thought about this 32-bit version of Street Racer. We're gonna once again start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, which gave the PlayStation version a so-so score of 7 out of 10. However, that doesn't tell the full story because there was a real disagreement between the two critics. Todd was impressed, giving it an 8. If you played and enjoyed the 16-bit version of Street Racer, then you will really appreciate the improvements that have been made to the PlayStation version of Street Racer. The frame rate is incredible, and it's very noticeable as you make your way around one of the 24 different 3D tracks. There's even a special Rumble mode where all cars battle it out, not to mention an 8-player link feature. Joe, on the other hand, was far less excited, giving the port a 6. I don't know why anyone bothered releasing this Mario Kart clone on the PlayStation. The developers were able to include a number of different tracks, but the tracks themselves are uninteresting and sometimes even tedious. The special attacks and abilities of the different racers make for some mild amusement, but it wears thin quickly. If you liked Mario Kart and you want to play it on the PlayStation, then this is your best bet. But if you're looking for real racing excitement, look elsewhere. Now, believe it or not, that 7 out of 10 is pretty much the basement when it comes to the scores. EGM's sister magazine Intelligent Gamer ended up giving it a C+. But outside of that, all the other scores are a lot friendlier to the game. For example, GamePro ended up giving it a 4 out of 5, which just so happens to be the same score that we saw from the notoriously grumpy Next Generation. Street Racer was originally a 16-bit title, a conscious take on Mario Kart. As such, it wasn't bad. Then again, it wasn't great either. In its 32-bit incarnation, however, while having changed very little in concept, it has been upgraded substantially in execution. The result is a game that, like the classic Micro Machines, isn't the most technically advanced or groundbreaking title of the season, but still manages to be just plain fun. In short, there's little here that you've never played before, but there's a lot of it, and it's put together extremely well. Moving up the scale, we see GameFan give the game an 82%, while Sega Power went 2 ticks higher, giving the 32-bit port an 84%. The highest score once again belongs to the Sega version of the game, with Mean Machine Sega going all the way up to an 87%. Street Racer Saturn's strengths and weaknesses are surprisingly close to those of the 16-bit game. Technically, the game is very impressive and smart looking, although the sprite-based cars use rather rudimentary animation. The meat of the game is pretty complex, with fighting, pickups, and steering all to be considered. But the tracks are sometimes too crowded, and the collision detection between the carts not too distinct. My main gripe is the weapons, much the same as the first game and just as ineffective. What's the point of taking time out to zap an enemy when it recovers almost without slowing down most of the time? The options are detailed, but some niggly gameplay aspects stop this from being a true classic. While that may sound a whole lot more negative than you might expect from somebody who just gave the game an 87%, the overall consensus is that Street Racer's 32-bit upgrade was an overall success. I mean, the overall average is 78%, which is really only a few ticks down from the 81% we saw from the 16-bit version. Not bad considering this was a 16-bit game that got a facelift for a new generation. Of the two, I say play this one. You know what? Both the 32-bit and the 16-bit versions have their own special charm. I say check them out in the Street Racer collection from QuByte Interactive. Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes just like this one every time classic games get added to modern consoles. We have a whole playlist with a couple hundred of these episodes. No, really. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite kart racing game? Look, there have been hundreds released over the last 30 years, including some genuinely great games. I can't wait to see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a bunch of reviews. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,